The morning I walked back into my brother's life, I was 34 years old, 7 months pregnant, and wearing the calmest expression I had ever put on my face. I had practiced it in the mirror that morning, in the bathroom of the hotel room Marcus and I had booked the night before, not because I was nervous, because I knew that the moment my brother saw anything other than complete composure on my face, he would think he had already won. He had been thinking that for 3 years. Let me tell you how this started. Not the polished version, the real one. My name is Claire. I grew up in Barrie, Ontario, in a house that looked perfectly normal from the outside, 2 stories, vinyl siding, a garden my mother tended every summer like it was the one thing in her life she could actually control. And maybe it was. Inside that house, my father ran everything else, not loudly. My father was never loud. He was the kind of man who could make you feel small with a single look across the dinner table, who could revise history in the middle of a conversation and make you believe you had misremembered. My brother Daniel learned from him. By the time we were teenagers, Daniel had become a smaller, hungrier version of our father, always watching for the angle, always positioning himself to come out ahead. I left Barrie at 22, not dramatically. I didn't pack a bag in the middle of the night or crawl out a window. I finished my nursing degree at Georgian College, accepted a position at a hospital in Ottawa, and told my family at Sunday dinner that I was moving. My father looked at me the way he always did when I made a decision without consulting him, like I had said something faintly ridiculous. Daniel smirked into his plate. My mother reached across the table and squeezed my hand and said nothing, which was the most she had ever been able to give me, and I had learned to accept it. I built a life in Ottawa, a real one. I made friends, I worked, I saved money, I became good at my job. 7 years in, I met Marcus at a conference. He was a guest speaker on federal healthcare policy, which sounds impossibly dry, but he was the only person in the room who made it funny. We dated for 2 years. We got married in a small ceremony at a conservation area outside the city in September, with exactly the people in attendance who had earned the right to be there. My parents came. Daniel came with his wife, Renee, who had the particular quality of making every room feel slightly colder than it was. My father died 14 months ago. He died in the house in Barrie, which he had owned outright, along with a modest RRSP, a TFSA with roughly $80,000, and a life insurance policy through Sun Life that my mother had been the named beneficiary on for 30 years. None of this was complicated. None of it should have been complicated. My mother called me the night he died. I drove to Barrie the next morning. Daniel was already there when I arrived, sitting at the kitchen table with a folder in front of him, and the folder should have been the first sign. The will, as my father had written it, divided his estate equally between Daniel and me. The house would be sold and the proceeds split. The RRSP and TFSA would go through the estate and be distributed accordingly. Standard. Clean. The kind of thing a notary in Barrie could have processed in 2 weeks. What Daniel had in that folder was a different will. He didn't show it to me that day. He waited 3 weeks. He waited until the initial probate process had begun. Waited until I was back in Ottawa and dealing with a full rotation at the hospital and a pregnancy that had just entered its 2nd trimester. Then he called me and told me, in the calm tone he had inherited directly from our father, that there was a later version of the will, that our father had revised it 8 months before his death. That in the revised version, Daniel received the house and the full contents of the estate, and I received a lump sum of $15,000. I sat with the phone against my ear for a long time after he said that. $15,000. The house alone was assessed at $640,000. I asked him to send me a copy of the document. He said the estate lawyer would be in touch. I asked him the name of the estate lawyer. He gave me a name I didn't recognize, not the notary my father had used for decades, but someone else, a firm in Barrie I had never heard of. I called Marcus that night and told him everything. He listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I love most about him. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Claire, I need to tell you something about my work that I don't talk about much. Marcus works for the federal government. I had always understood that vaguely healthcare policy, regulatory oversight, something in that direction. What I had not fully understood, because he is genuinely one of the most private people I have ever met, was the specific branch he worked for. He is a senior investigator with the Financial Transactions and Reports Analysis Centre of Canada, FINTRAC, the agency responsible for detecting financial fraud, money laundering, estate manipulation. He had been doing it for 11 years. He said, "Don't respond to the lawyer yet. Don't sign anything. Give me 2 weeks." I gave him 2 weeks. What he found in those 2 weeks working through proper channels with the appropriate warrants and the cooperation of the Law Society of Ontario, was this. The estate lawyer Daniel had retained had been flagged twice in the previous 5 years for involvement in suspicious will modifications. The notary who had supposedly witnessed my father's signature on the revised will had been at a medical conference in Vancouver on the date the document was signed. My father's physician confirmed that 8 months before his death, my father had been assessed for early-stage vascular dementia and had been found to have significantly diminished capacity to execute new legal documents. The revised will was fraudulent, but Daniel didn't know that we knew. The estate reading was scheduled for a Tuesday in March at the offices of Daniel's chosen lawyer in downtown Barrie. Marcus and I drove up the night before. We stayed at a hotel on Dunlop Street, and in the morning I stood in the bathroom and practiced keeping my face still. I was 7 months pregnant. My back ached. I had been awake since 4 in the morning, and I was about to walk into a room where my brother planned to formalize stealing our mother's security and my inheritance while she sat there and let it happen, because she had spent 40 years letting the men in that family do whatever they decided to do. Marcus drove. He didn't say much on the way there. He knew I needed quiet. He reached across the center console at a red light on Bayfield Street and put his hand over mine, and I looked at him, and he gave me the smallest nod. That nod meant, I'm here. It meant, we have everything we need. It meant, whenever you're ready. The office was on the 4th floor of a glass building near the waterfront. The waiting room had gray upholstered chairs and a print of the group of 7 on the wall, and a receptionist who smiled at us with the practiced warmth of someone who had learned to treat every visitor the same, regardless of what had brought them there. Daniel was already in the boardroom with Renee and the lawyer, a man named Whitmore, when we were shown in. Daniel stood when I entered, not out of respect, I knew, but because standing first was a power move he had been doing since we were children. He was wearing a suit. He had the folder again, or one like it. He looked at Marcus, and something shifted in his face, not quite recognition, but recalibration. Daniel had met Marcus at the wedding and at 2 Christmases since. He had always dismissed him pleasantly. The way you dismiss something that doesn't register as a threat, Claire, he said. Glad you could make it. I sat down. Marcus sat beside me. Whitmore began with the procedural language, the formal opening of the estate reading, the confirmation of the parties present, the acknowledgement that the deceased had left a testamentary document dated the previous February. He slid copies across the table. I looked at my copy. I had seen it before. Marcus had obtained a copy through the Law Society investigation. As you can see, Daniel said, before Whitmore had even finished his introduction, Dad was very clear about his wishes. He wanted the family home to stay in the family. He wanted continuity. I'll be taking over the mortgage payments on the property. There's still $60,000 owing and I'll be maintaining it. $15,000 will be transferred to your account within 30 days of probate closing. Renee had her hands folded on the table. She was looking at me with an expression I recognized, the measured look of someone waiting for you to get emotional so they can be visibly reasonable in contrast. I said, can I ask a question about the witness signature on page 3? Whitmore blinked. Of course. The witness listed is a notary named Paul Arsenault. Are you aware that Mr. Arsenault was registered as attending the Ontario Notarial Association's annual conference in Vancouver on the date this document was signed? I have the conference registration records here if that would be helpful. I slid a printed document across the table. Marcus had printed 4 copies. I slid one to Whitmore, one toward where Daniel was sitting, and kept one for myself. The room was very quiet. Daniel said, that's not that document could be from anywhere. It's from the ONA's conference archive, I said, publicly accessible. The conference ran from the 14th to the 16th. The will is dated the 15th. Whitmore picked up the page and read it. His expression did not change, but something behind his eyes did. There's also the matter of my father's medical assessment, I continued. His physician, Dr. Lanthier, at the Barrie Medical Center, where Dad had been a patient for 22 years, documented in February of last year that my father had been assessed for vascular dementia and found to have significantly diminished testamentary capacity. That assessment predates this document by 6 weeks. Under Ontario's Substitute Decisions Act, that creates a significant legal problem for the validity of anything he signed in that window. I slid the second document across the table. Renee's hands had separated. They were no longer folded. Daniel said, where did you get that? Dr. Lanthier provided it voluntarily when contacted through appropriate channels, Marcus said. It was the first time he had spoken since we sat down. His voice was very calm. Medical records relating to testamentary capacity can be released to parties with standing in an estate dispute. Claire has standing. Daniel looked at Marcus. Really looked at him, for what I think was the first time. "Who are you exactly?" he said. Marcus reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and placed his identification on the table. "Federal government. FinTrack. I'm her husband," he said. "I'm also a senior investigator with the Financial Transactions and Reports Analysis Center of Canada, which means I have a professional interest in the financial dimensions of what's been happening with this estate. Separately from my personal interest, which is that someone has been attempting to defraud my wife." Daniel stood up. He actually stood up, which was almost not funny, because nothing about that day was funny, but it was something I recognized. It was the thing he did when a situation stopped going the way he had planned, and he needed to change the physical geometry of the room to feel like he still had control of it. Our father used to do the same thing. "This is harassment," he said. "This is Whitmore. This is harassment. They can't come in here and make accusations without—" "Mr. Whitmore," Marcus said, without raising his voice at all, "you may want to be aware that a formal complaint has already been filed with the Law Society of Ontario regarding your firm's involvement in the preparation of this document. That complaint is active. I would recommend that you speak with your own counsel before proceeding further with this reading today." Whitmore closed the folder in front of him. He closed it quietly, with the precision of a man who had just understood the exact dimensions of the situation he was in. Daniel was still standing. He was looking at me now, not at Marcus, at me. I looked back at him. I thought about the Sunday dinners where he had smirked into his plate. I thought about the phone call 3 years ago where he had told me, in our father's careful voice, that I was getting $15,000. I thought about my mother, who was not in this room because she had not been told about the meeting. Daniel had told her the reading was next week, which Marcus had discovered when he called her to check, and who had spent 4 decades in a house with 2 men who decided things without her. I said, "You should call your lawyer, Daniel. Your own lawyer, not Whitmore." He left the room. Renee followed him. The sound of the door closing was very controlled, which told me more than a slam would have. Whitmore looked at me across the table. He was a man in his late 50s with the face of someone who had done this job long enough to understand that not every client tells you the full story before they put a document in front of you. He said, "I think we need to adjourn today's reading." "I think that's wise," I said. In the hallway afterward, Marcus put his hand on the small of my back, and we walked to the elevator, and I pressed the button for the lobby, and I stood there watching the numbers descend, and I did not cry. I had thought that when it was over, something would release. But what I felt instead was something quieter than that. Something that had been tightly wound for 3 years, slowly beginning to loosen. The estate case took another 4 months to resolve. Daniel retained a criminal defense lawyer within the week, which told us everything we needed to know about what he understood his exposure to be. The fraudulent will was formally invalidated by the Ontario Superior Court of Justice. Whitmore's firm was referred to the Law Society disciplinary process. The notary Paul Arsenault, who, it turned out, had signed the document in advance of the trip and had not actually been present when Daniel and the fake witnesses finalized the paperwork, faced separate proceedings. My mother got the house. She had been the named beneficiary on the life insurance policy all along, and the Sun Life payout came through without any of the estate complications because it had never been part of the estate to begin with. That was the one thing that had never been in dispute, and that no one had been able to touch. The RRSP and TFSA were distributed according to the original will, which the court reinstated as the valid document. I got my share, not $15,000, half. I called my mother the evening the court ruling came through. She was quiet for a long time when I told her. Then she said, "I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner." And I understood that she wasn't talking only about Daniel. She was talking about 30 years of patterns that were older than either of us. I said, "I know, Mom." She asked about the baby. I told her we had finally settled on a name. She cried a little at that, the good kind of crying, and I let her. And I looked across the kitchen at Marcus, who was making dinner and pretending not to listen, and I thought about the moment in the elevator when I had pressed the button for the lobby, and the numbers had descended, and I had felt that long wound thing begin to let go. My daughter was born 6 weeks later. We named her Eleanor. She is the most stubborn, alert, wide-eyed person I have ever met. And she came into the world in Ottawa in the middle of a Thursday afternoon with Marcus holding my hand and absolutely not crying, which is what he told the nurses, even though I could see perfectly well that he was. I don't talk to Daniel. I don't know if I ever will. There are people who would tell me I should try that he's family, that family is complicated, that time changes things. And maybe they're right. But I also know that family is not only blood. It's the person who sits beside you in a lawyer's office and puts his identification on the table and says, in the calmest voice you've ever heard, I'm her husband. It's the woman who squeezes your hand across the dinner table and can't say the full thing but means it. It's the daughter who arrived screaming and completely unimpressed with everyone in the room. The thing about people like my brother is that they count on you to be smaller than you are. They count on the distance and the exhaustion and the logistics and the fact that fighting back takes more energy than most people have when they're working full-time and pregnant and 4 hours from where the problem lives. They count on the version of you that stood in that kitchen at 22 and left quietly. They forget that you've had 12 years to become someone else entirely. They forget that the person you married has 11 years of federal investigative experience and a very particular set of professional contacts. They forget that tactical patience is not the same thing as giving up. I stepped across the threshold of that boardroom, knowing exactly what we had. I had practiced my face in the mirror not because I was uncertain, but because I wanted to give my brother the full experience of watching the ground shift under him with no warning whatsoever. I think that was the most important part. I had a target. I had waited until the moment was right. And when I sat down at that table, 7 months pregnant, back aching, 4 hours of sleep behind me, I was the most dangerous person in the room. He just didn't know it yet.